Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Franks, and the creation of Charlemagne's empire. Today is episode 10, The Franks Become the New Big Bad. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Theodoric had gained control of Italy, but he faced the challenge of ruling it. Hoping to strengthen his position in the region, Theodoric made several marriage alliances with the rulers of the kingdoms in the former Western Roman Empire. Although the Ostrogoths were Homoian Christians, Theodoric was tolerant of the Catholic majority in Italy, so he had smooth relations with the church, and he was even asked to resolve a dispute between rival claimants for the papacy. However, the Eastern Roman Emperor refused to make Theodoric Western Roman Emperor, although he did recognize Theodoric as ruler of Italy. Meanwhile, Clovis had united several Frankish warbands under his leadership and was expanding into Visigoth territory. Still, the Franks remained too weak to defeat the Visigoths, so Clovis needed a new target for expansion. There were not many options, so it should not be a surprise that the Burgundians were the next target. However, Clovis did not want to simply invade a neighbor's lands. That would be rude, so he needed an excuse. Actually, he already had an excuse since Gundobad had murdered the parents of his wife Clotilde 2 years after they had married. What he really needed was an opportunity. That opportunity appeared when Gundobad fought his remaining brother Godegisel. Actually, both sides asked for help from Clovis, although it seems a bit tactless of Gundobad to ask Clovis for help since he had murdered his wife's parents. Anyway, Clovis unsurprisingly supported Godegisel. Fortunately, Alaric, the Visigoth king, backed Gundobad, and the proxy war ended with a Frankish defeat. While Gundobad was probably relieved that he had retained his throne and his head, he soon learned that the Visigoths had not helped out of the kindness of their hearts. Obviously, a gesture was needed to express his gratitude, so Gundobad handed over the city of Avignon in 501. The following year, Clovis and Alaric met on the border of their two kingdoms and attempted to find a way to ensure peaceful coexistence. Well, one can hope that they wanted peace, but more likely they simply agreed to a temporary pause in hostilities that would be broken as soon as one side felt strong enough. This temporary peace meant that Clovis did not have to worry about his borders to the south, so he moved next against the Alemanni, who lived to the northeast of the Burgundians. Actually, the campaign against the Alemanni was part of an alliance with the other major Frankish leader, Sigisbert the Lame, king of the Rhineland Franks. When the Alemanni were crushed in 505, Gundobad found himself in a difficult situation. In theory, his position was stronger since he had finally managed to kill his remaining brother Godegisel, so he was the unchallenged ruler of the Burgundians. However, he was also placed between two expansionist kingdoms, the Franks and the Visigoths, so he would have to choose a side. It seems strange that the Ostrogoths had not taken advantage of the conflict between their neighbors on the other side of the Alps. Well, Theodoric had other options for expansion, so he had expanded east into the Balkans. The expansion was actually a defensive maneuver to block the invasion route of any army from Constantinople. The annexation of Balkan territory by Theodoric was not received well by Emperor Anastasius, Zeno's successor, who viewed that region as part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Unfortunately, the emperor did not have the resources to launch a campaign to retake the lands, so he sent envoys to Theodoric's neighbors to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. Theodoric may or may not have been aware of the emperor's plotting, but he did know that the empire's war with Persia had ended in late 506, so the emperor would soon be free to turn his attention to the Goth kingdom in Italy. As I said, Clovis and Alaric had agreed to a pause in hostilities, but either side would break the truce the moment they felt strong enough. Well, that moment occurred in 507 when Clovis had arranged an alliance with the Burgundians. More important, Sigisbert returned the favor and joined the campaign against the Visigoths. Wait, Gundobad allied with Clovis against the Visigoths, even though the Visigoths had aided him against the Franks just a few years earlier? Maybe Gundobad really resented being forced to hand over Avignon to Alaric. Theodoric had constructed an impressive web of marriage alliances with nearly all of the various kingdoms, and he dutifully sent letters urging peace. Unfortunately, Clovis had little interest in peace and ignored his brother-in-law. Was it merely a desire to ensure smooth family gatherings that drove Theodoric to send so many letters urging peace? Possibly, but he was probably trying to cement his position as Western Emperor rather than mere King of Italy. Repeated embassies to Constantinople had pressed with increasing insistence for official recognition of his position in Italy. Well, Theodoric's attempt to serve as peacemaker and his extended family had failed, so he had no choice but to help his son-in-law against his brother-in-law. Not exactly. Relations with the Eastern Empire were tense. Aware that an imperial fleet could simply sail to Italy, Theodoric contacted his brother-in-law in Carthage to ask for a Vandal fleet to help protect his coast. However, no Vandal fleet appeared. Apparently, Theodoric was surprised when Thrasimund refused to send a fleet, but he should not have been. Aside from the fact that Thrasimund did not want to damage his own relations with Constantinople, Theodoric had failed to offer the Vandal king anything to make it worth sending a fleet to defend Italy. This is more important than it sounds. Raising a fleet would be expensive, and men's lives would be risked, and Thrasimund was supposed to do this as a favor to his brother-in-law? However, a fleet did arrive, an imperial fleet that raided along the Adriatic coastline of Italy in 507. So Theodoric was busy trying to stop raids instead of aiding his son-in-law Alaric. If the timing seems suspicious, that is because Constantinople had arranged a temporary alliance with Clovis, which benefited both parties. Probably more like an agreement to attack around the same time than an actual alliance. Regardless, Clovis and his army linked up with a Burgundian army led by Gundobad's sons Sigismund and Godemar in 507. The invasion of Visigoth territory was not a surprise, but Alaric apparently delayed, hoping that he would be joined by Theodoric's army. Eventually it became clear that the Ostrogoths were not coming, so Alaric faced the Franks and the Burgundians alone at Vioulle. The Visigoths were defeated, and Alaric died in the battle. The victory over the Visigoths would have consequences in Frankish territory. Clovis had already killed or forced the submission of several rival Frankish kings, but he finally felt strong enough to deal with the more powerful rivals after the victory against the Visigoths. So he defeated Sigebert despite a long, mutually beneficial alliance. The legend is that Clovis encouraged Sigebert's son Cloderic to murder his father and seize the throne. When Cloderic followed his advice, Clovis then killed Cloderic and defended his action by publicly accusing Cloderic of murdering his father, so the Rhineland Franks chose Clovis as their king. The truth is probably more unpleasant, but the main result is that Clovis's kingdom of Salian Franks, who were Christian and more Romanized, absorbed the more pagan and less Romanized Rhineland Franks. While the elimination of a pagan political entity of Franks appeared to have ended the diversity of religious belief, the Rhineland Franks would continue to resist their forcible integration into the Frankish kingdom. It is important to stress that the Visigoths had been the big bad in the Western Roman Empire for decades before the Franks replaced them, or more accurately drove them out of Aquitaine. Still, although the Visigoths had lost Toulouse, they retained control over the Mediterranean coast with the thriving urban centers of Narbonne, Nîmes, and Carcassonne. Even so, the future prospects for the Visigoths were not good. Part of the problem is that Alaric did not have a clear succession, so his nobles would have to choose between his two sons. The older one, Gesalec, was an adult but was considered illegitimate, while the younger one, Amalaric, was a child but legitimate. More interested in ability than legitimacy, the Visigoth nobles backed Gesalec as king. Unfortunately, he failed to defend Narbonne against the Burgundians and the Franks, and appeared unable to break a Burgundian siege of Carcassonne, so Theodoric concluded that he needed to intervene on behalf of his grandson. Since no imperial fleet had appeared in the summer of 508, Theodoric was able to send an army north to drive the Franks and the Burgundians out of Provence. The Ostrogoths' counteroffensive hit the Burgundians harder than the Franks because the Burgundians were closer to Italy. Gundobad not only lost the Visigoth lands that he had captured, but suffered damage from raids. He was in his 70s, so he stopped the war. Clovis was forced to give up some of his new lands, but he did keep much of Aquitaine, including Toulouse. If Theodoric and Alaric's successor had combined to push north and retake Toulouse, Clovis would have had a problem, but Theodoric soon became preoccupied with affairs in the Visigoth kingdom. While it may have been embarrassing to need help from the Ostrogoths, Gesalec could now focus on rebuilding his kingdom. Not exactly. Theodoric might have accepted Gesalec as king rather than his grandson if Gesalec had been effective, but he wasn't, and Theodoric expected a return on the expense of sending an army to drive out the Franks and the Burgundians. So, what did Theodoric want? Nothing for him, but he felt that it would be best for everyone if Gesalec considered a different career option, enabling Theodoric's grandson to become king, under proper guidance, of course. Oh, and Provence became part of the Ostrogoth kingdom. While the territory of Provence was relatively small, it was quite prosperous since trade from the Mediterranean passed through its ports, especially thriving Marseille and Arles. While Theodoric may have claimed that he was simply interfering on behalf of his grandson Amalaric, he seemed to rule the Visigoth kingdom directly. By 511, Theodoric described himself as king of the Goths in Hispania. Gesalec refused to abandon his throne, but he lost and fled south in 510. He needed an ally to oppose Theodoric and found one in King Thrasimund of the Vandals, who provided enough silver for Gesalec to recruit a new army. Honestly, most of Theodoric's marriage alliance had produced little benefit, but this one was especially poor. Thrasimund did not send his fleet to aid his brother-in-law against the Eastern Empire's fleet in 507. Worse, he had no problem backing an opponent of his brother-in-law. Anyway, Gesalec lost again. Viewing Gesalec as a bad investment, Thrasimund declined to provide any more support, so Gesalec was on his way to King Gundobad of the Burgundians when he was caught and executed, probably in 513. Actually, Thrasimund soon realized that he had dangerously provoked Theodoric when he received a letter asking why he supported Gesalec against his brother-in-law. As the ruler of Italy and Hispania, Theodoric's anger could not be ignored, so Thrasimund sent a letter of apology to Theodoric asking for forgiveness. In fact, Thrasimund would avoid a repeat provocation until he died. While Gesalec had been defeated, he had supporters. Admittedly, those supporters were unwilling to continue to revolt against Theodoric, but they were undoubtedly resentful. In theory, that resentment could have been diffused with the declaration that Alaric's young son Amalaric would be king, guided by his loving grandfather. Instead, an Ostrogoth named Theodas was appointed Amalaric's guardian, but not regent, since Theodoric had appointed himself king of Hispania. Despite the loss of Provence, the Visigoth-controlled region of Hispania was prosperous, so it generated substantial tax revenue, part of which flowed to Ravenna. At this point, the Franks had a sizable kingdom, but it was dwarfed by Theodoric, who controlled Italy, the region of Gaul that bordered the Mediterranean, most of Hispania, the Dalmatian coast, and part of the Balkans. Moreover, he had forced the Burgundians and the Vandals in North Africa to recognize his authority, or at least to state publicly that they recognized his authority. While he had not recreated the Roman Empire, Theodoric had certainly made a good start. Without a doubt, he was dominant in Western Europe. Even so, he still did not officially call himself emperor, although he had adopted imperial ceremonies. Why did he hesitate? Probably to avoid a formal break in relations with Constantinople, which would mean an unnecessary war in the east, when he clearly wanted to expand south and northeast. Perhaps his Gothic followers believed that the Gothic kingdom was superior, so the title Emperor of Rome would actually be a demotion. To be fair, the Goths had conquered Rome, not the other way around. So Theodoric could take pride in his accomplishments, even if he did not formally call himself emperor. If only he had an heir. Since he was nearly 60 by 511, he was unlikely to produce one, and his marriage to Clovis's sister Odefleda had only produced a daughter, Amalasuentha. He undoubtedly considered the matter in 511 since his rival Clovis died that year. Speaking of Clovis, in 511, the Frankish king held a council of bishops at Orléans, which produced the first known Frankish law code. although it probably just gathered together previous legal decisions. Interesting, none of the bishops were from the more recently conquered Frankish territory, Sigibert's former kingdom on the other side of the Ardennes, what would become known as the Kingdom of Austrasia. This region was ruled by Clovis's adult son Theodoric, but it is unlikely that there was a problem between father and son. More likely, the region was culturally different, and Clovis did not want to press Christianity on a recently conquered region. Less than a year later, Clovis was dead. So, who would inherit the kingdom? To sum up, Clovis continued to expand until he threatened the Visigoths. An alliance with the Burgundians ensured the defeat of Alaric at Vioulle, and he died in the battle. Alaric was succeeded by his illegitimate son Gesalec, but the new king proved unable to cope with an invasion by the Franks and the Burgundians. Fortunately, Theodoric sent an army that drove out the invaders, but he saw an opportunity to force Gesalec off the throne in favor of his grandson Amalaric. Unsurprisingly, Gesalec resisted, but was defeated, even with support from the Vandals. Actually, Theodoric had realized that his grandson was too young to rule, so Theodoric made himself king of the Goths in Italy and the Goths in Hispania. Meanwhile, Clovis had taken control of the other main Frankish kingdom, but he died in 511. Since he had 4 sons, it is worth asking if the kingdom would break apart, and I will discuss the Frankish succession next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.